Okay, I'd like to get us started. As we're finding our spots and enjoying lunch, and to those of you on Zoom, maybe you're having a lunch too, or a cup of coffee and getting ready to listen to our speakers. I just want to give a shout out to our tech team, our big tech team. We have Nicole Howard, Patricia Brown, and why am I blanking? Sarah Thomas in the back of the house, and also in the back of the house in person here, we have Daryl and Jim who are doing a great job. So between all of that, we are managing to have a pretty good hybrid meeting so far. One of the gurus of high flex curriculum design is at my college, so I don't know if we can quite call this high flex yet. Brian Beatty might not be so sure, but definitely a great hybrid meeting. And I really appreciate everybody's willingness to do what it takes to be together in this hybrid modality. So we have some wonderful speakers with us. They are joining us virtually, but you'll be able to see and hear them great if you're in the room and on Zoom as well. Our speakers are John Rogers from UCLA's IDEA and CenterX, and Micah Pollock from UCSD. I'll introduce them momentarily. They are the lead authors of a report that just came out in January called The Conflict Campaign, Exploring Local Experiences of the Campaign to Ban Critical Race Theory in Public K-12 Education in the US 2020 to 2021. So we are really happy to have them joining us because this, of course, is a pretty intense context for a lot of the work that we're doing. And I think we in California are hearing this in different places all over the state, but it will also get the national context from our colleagues, John and Micah. John Rogers, besides being somebody I knew back when I was back in grad school, is a professor of education at UCLA's School of Education and Information Studies. He is the director of UCLA's Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access, IDEA, and the faculty director of UCLA's CenterX. John studies the relationship of education, democracy, and different forms of inequality. He has also written widely on democratic participation and community organizing as strategies for advancing educational equity and civic renewal. And Micah Pollock is professor of education studies at the University of California, San Diego. An anthropologist, she has long studied how educators and young people talk about race and diversity and how education communities can improve opportunity collectively. John and Micah, we are also thrilled that you are meeting the California Council on Teacher Education group here today. This group represents faculty, leaders, agency colleagues from across the state, and truly is the only group that brings together the independent colleges, the CSUs, and the UCs in one place around educator preparation. Actually, I'll qualify that. I think the CTC, the commission, is the other place where everybody is together, right? But as a nonprofit organization, this really is. And so we relish and cherish this time that we have together and really like to meet new allies and people who can help us expand our thinking around education policy and all kinds of things. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the two of you. And I believe you will be, there you are. All right. We
yes,
see
thank you.
And I think you can see us. Thanks.
Great. Can you hear me all right?
Yes. Thanks.
Great. So John and I decided that I would blast through some top line findings from our report and study, and John would speak after that on some thoughts for doing our work in a democracy and teacher education implications specifically. So John will be displaying the slides and I will ask him to move forward. Report, the Conflict Campaign, just came out, as was just said, and really was a rapid response study in an effort to try to understand this striking context for teaching and learning across the nation. If you go to the next slide, you can see our definition of the conflict campaign. We call it a conflict campaign after several months of study over the previous summer and into early fall. We call it a conflict campaign because we are interested in a movement that has both manufactured a lot of conflict for education communities, in many cases to partisan ends, but also exploited pre-existing divisions, pre-existing habits of pushback related to how to teach about race and for inclusion in US society and US schools. So a campaign kind of, if you can imagine, sort of pouring gasoline on existing differences of opinion and going beyond deliberating about how to teach and how to support learning on issues of race or racism or diversity and inclusion and equity into campaigns to restrict and ban such work. Under this umbrella of anti-quote unquote critical race theory, legislation, and local action. So the second bullet here, the idea that CRT becomes this kind of caricatured catch-all term that opponents began using over the 2020-21 school year to try to limit, restrict, prohibit learning related to race, racism, DEI. And we explored how various language, strategies, tactics shared across various local iterations of the conflict campaign, shared across state legislation, and shared in activity by some pretty powerful conservative entities, as well as partisan politicians, exploiting and fomenting local frustration and difference of opinion. So the next slide, we start to get into some of our findings and study. The conflict campaign, as we came to look at it, involved state legislation, which has really mostly been investigated by others, though we did look at the local experience of state legislation by educators. But now, when we started, it was in the 50s, in terms of legislative actions, trying to restrict what folks were calling critical race theory or teaching about race in general, or diversity, gender. Now up to over 160. PEN America has been looking at this in a number of ongoing reports. So state legislation, what we were really also wanting to look at that folks hadn't investigated so much was this incitement of local restriction effort. So this was the kind of work when we all started seeing folks rushing the school board, but also other tactics that we will be mentioning and that we explored, where people were inciting local effort to try to counter and restrict teaching and learning where they lived. And in the past months, even as we released this report and continuing, not only have we seen the legislative effort continue to grow, but we're seeing this morph into various forms, including book ban efforts as we head into 2022. So our study, if you go to the next slide, John, we did a mix of methods. We reviewed, and John valiantly reviewed, I should mention, with a team of doctoral students across our two institutions, an explosion of media stories. We noted a vast sort of prevalence of conservative news media coverage of this CRT. We put it in quotes because often, as we'll be saying, folks are really caricaturing not only K-12 teaching and learning as critical race theory, but also scholarship on critical race theory. So we put it in quotes to make that point. But we reviewed nearly 10,000 media stories, saw that there were more than 7 stories from national conservative news sources about CRT, quote unquote, in public schools, for every one from a more mainstream or liberal media source. But our team also looked at sort of mainstream local media coverage in districts across the country and found nearly 900 of them plagued by a kind of local controversy related to efforts to restrict CRT. We also did a survey of national teacher organizations, several of which lean toward supporting teachers who tend toward teaching on race and diversity. And also we interviewed 21 equity officers at the district level across the country. So the next slide demonstrates some of this shared tactics that we started to look at in a walk through what we called the conflict campaign at the national level, the state level, all that legislation, and then at the local level. And these are some examples of what to us sort of demonstrated a campaign going beyond sort of admirable deliberation over how to teach about race and diversity effectively into efforts that veered into anti-democratic efforts to handle teaching and learning. The effort to caricature what teachers do. So anything from toolkits or handbooks saying that K-12 schools are teaching quote unquote CRT, which itself is trying to discriminate against white people, which CRT is not. Folks saying CRT or K-12 teaching teaches children to hate themselves, each other, and their country. Even statements like, CRT is about trying to get people to discriminate against whites and sometimes Asians. Anti-racism is about embracing racial discrimination. A lot of caricaturing of the work of teachers and scholarship. Conflating triggering issues was a habit we saw where anxieties about the pandemic or homophobic tendencies would get hooked together with critiques of CRT so that in an effort to mobilize people's anxieties, using very combative language and intimidation tactics as opposed to, walking into a school district to talk about a professional development or a lesson. Instead, having, sort of almost the language of war, intimidation, trying to get people fired. The effort to censor and restrict learning as opposed to discuss how to do it effectively, major tactic of anything from legislation to handbooks and toolkits, and webinars, urging people to confront their local schools and systems and trying to restrict and censor learning. And then finally, this effort to control schools and as well government. So toolkits asking people to take back their schools or to target their school boards to control them again. And also in sometimes partisan politics in pretty plain sight, where somebody, for example, in Southlake, Texas, might say as a Republican leader in a celebratory post-school board win event, we have to export this, quote, to every single major suburban area outside of a blue city, sort of partisan politics in plain sight in some cases. Some findings just to finish up before handing it to John, and we want to engage anybody who is feeling that what we're saying is resonant or not in the chat and afterwards. This map on this slide here, the next slide, demonstrates our findings about where. On the left is a slide made by PEN America, that image of where the legislation has been. The slide on the right is from our report looking at where local campaigns were sort of loud enough locally and covered by local media. So loud enough to make the news locally in mainstream news sources that we counted. And these were the districts that added up to almost 900 districts that in total serve 35% of the student population, 18 million students that we called impacted by these localized campaigns loud enough to make the news. These were places across states, almost all the states in the country. They were large, mid-sized, small. They were places where there were bills and places where there were not bills. And the strongest predictor of where this kind of local conflict campaign action happened in our analysis was whether the district had been rapidly changing demographically. So a district that had seen over 18% decline in white population over the last 20 years was the type of district most likely to be in this kind of local conflagration with people literally trying to ban or restrict CRT. We also saw that they were predominantly 1 and 2 of the districts in this situation were what we called racially mixed and majority white. So also districts tended to be politically contested in their voting patterns. So places that were contested politically and where, and you might argue folks are most in need of talking through issues of difference, of diversity, and diverging opinions. So some last slides on the effects on educators, because this is something that really needs to be understood further and should really concern everybody focused on teaching and learning. We, in our survey and in our interviews, saw a lot of educators afraid. We saw districts that very proactively protected the right to learn. Some of the slides coming up, which I may not have time for now, but could show in Q&A, demonstrate formal school board in 13 cases, for example, very formal proclamations of the right to learn and backing up the right to learn on issues of race, racism, diversity. But a majority of our survey respondents said that they reported over that complicated school year, 20 to 21, experiencing efforts to restrict learning on these issues and a sense of real attack on this type of teaching across the country. The next slide, we had a lot of equity officers talk about very personalized experiences of intimidation, ranging from, shocking, death threats through my Twitter account, but also various tactics, social media attacks, my texts requested and put out on the internet, teachers telling us about having lesson plans demanded, calls for firing teachers, etc. Next slide. We saw patterns. We can give out these slides after our talk since there are too many data points here, but some administrators advising caution, some administrators restricting themselves, telling the superintendent, telling folks or an advisor, you can't say things are racist anymore, don't teach controversial issues anymore. Very distressing stories in our data that need further consideration of administrators themselves cautioning and restricting. We also saw in the next slide, folks encouraging learning. So we got really interested in the sort of role of the leader in protecting the right to learn. The next slide, slide 11, John, looks at some of these examples of local districts actually, putting out proclamations and policy of the right to learn. The next slide shows a lot of folks walking back in a sort of another version of restriction, subtly walking back. So maybe I'll just point you now to that example from New Hampshire, third from the top, where a teacher said, in comparison to fall 2020, where everybody was celebrating my efforts at DEI or working on race in my district, the district has gone silent. So another version of shutting down this work. And finally, we'll stop on slide 13. A kind of restriction that concerns us quite a bit is also self-censorship by teachers. So this dynamic where teachers, again, in states with legal efforts to restrict learning and with just local, saying that they were planning on avoiding controversial topics, staying silent on topics they used to teach. And I want to just flag what they were not saying, I am no longer going to teach my 7-week white supremacy unit. They were saying, I'm afraid now to teach about race. I'm afraid to talk about gender. I'm afraid to teach the Bill of Rights, and I won't. And so this kind of self-censorship is something of great concern and requires next steps to understand what's going on in districts as we move forward. I'm going to stop here and turn it over to John for some reflections on teacher ed.
Thanks, Micah. Thank you for laying out the kind of the broad contours of the conflict campaign. I'm sure many of you are now asking yourselves, what do I do with all of this challenging information? So in the next few minutes, I want to walk through 5 possible roles for teacher educators. A first task I want to suggest for teacher educators is to help teachers process the emotional experience of the conflict campaign. Amidst the last couple of years of the pandemic, teachers have faced extraordinary demands and unprecedented challenges. Now, after accepting more vulnerability and taking on more responsibility, many teachers across the nation have been attacked in the context of the conflict campaign. Teacher educators can now hold space for new and veteran teachers to share their feelings and process this experience. They can invite educators to speak to questions such as, what does it mean to have your sphere of work, your passion, become a site of political conflict, a tactical card for partisans to play? What does it mean to you as a person and as a professional that after so many years of silent neglect, suddenly your work is receiving all of this unwanted and misguided public attention? How does it feel to have your words and your work under surveillance, to be suspected of harming your students? How are you affected when you are told you shouldn't express your care and love for your students by affirming their experiences and their history? These may or may not be the right questions for teachers in your communities, depending on how the conflict campaign has been experienced. But I believe it's important for teachers to name and make sense of the emotional toll of the attacks as one dimension of the broader response. A second role for teacher educators is to help teachers understand the conflict campaign as part of a broader historical and political dynamic. Here I'm drawn to the opening line of James Baldwin's 1963 classic, A Talk to Teachers. He wrote, "Let's begin by saying that we are living through a very dangerous time." Yes, indeed. Of course, our own dangerous times differ in certain ways from 1963, but now as then, we can say that American democracy is experiencing a crisis. More than a quarter of Americans in a poll last spring classified themselves as, quote, highly right-wing authoritarian. A poll this fall found broad anxieties over increasing racial and ethnic diversity in the United States. A majority of all Americans and 98% of those who trust far-right news sources agreed with the statement, today, America is in danger of losing its culture and identity. Issues of diversity and race are deeply implicated in this crisis. America is undergoing profound demographic changes, which have significant implications for who holds and who wields political power. Whereas in 1950, white Christians represented more than 90% of the American electorate, that figure is projected to fall below 50% by 2024. Attacks on democratic practices and principles are often fueled by anxieties around these changes and related concerns about how opportunities, wealth, and power are distributed. It's important for teachers to understand the conflict campaign as an expression of these dynamics. Understanding this reality does not provide teachers with easy answers about what to do. Teachers committed to educating young people toward critical engagement in democracy sometimes find themselves at odds with fellow community members who do not share their vision of justice or of education. A third role for teacher educators, thus, is to help teachers grapple with the dilemmas of democratic education. James Baldwin's Talk to Teachers is an essential resource. He wrote, "The paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated. The purpose of education finally is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself, to make his own decisions, to say to himself, this is black or this is white, to decide for himself whether there is a God in heaven or not. To ask questions of the universe and then learn to live with those questions is the way he achieves his own identity. But no society is really anxious to have that kind of person around. What societies really ideally want is a citizenry which will simply obey the rules of society." Teachers need to reflect on Baldwin's paradox and the complexity that this marks out for their own role. They need to recognize that they work in public institutions funded through public dollars that serve ideologically diverse communities, and that they have a positive obligation to help young people ask questions of the universe and learn to live with those questions. It's not easy or comfortable to hold all these understandings at once, but this is part of the reality that democratic educators need to learn to live with. When faced with conflict and contention amidst destructive partisan campaigns, some educators respond by withdrawing from civic and political life. But teachers cannot cede this space. It's not good for them or their students or the future of democracy. A fourth role for teacher educators is to encourage teachers to practice democracy-enhancing politics. A few years ago, Joel Westheimer and I examined conditions associated with teachers in the US and Canada discussing issues of inequality with their students. we found that the single greatest predictor of such discussions is whether or not teachers themselves are civically and politically engaged, whether they talk about civic and political issues and participate in efforts to improve their community or broader society. It's important for teacher educators to create opportunities for their students to be in dialogue with labor leaders and coalitions of youth and community groups working to deepen democracy and advance racial and social justice. Finally, it's not enough for teacher educators to simply say no to the conflict campaign. Teacher educators should help new teachers envision an alternative framework for our times. I've recently been working with some colleagues on a possible frame. This framework acknowledges that California is home to more than 9 million precious children and youth who, through their diverse identities, languages, and experiences, embody extraordinary potential. As a state, we must provide rich opportunities for young people to understand and tap into these cultural resources. We have a responsibility to enhance their creative and intellectual capabilities and foster their respect for and deep connection to one another and the land that sustains us all. And because young people today face heightened political division and unprecedented social and environmental challenges, it's imperative that they develop the skills and commitments necessary to address our shared problems and envision a more promising future. In short, we must educate for a multiracial democracy. In the course of working on this framework, I discovered a book that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about race and democracy in 1945. At the end of World War II, Du Bois noted that to date, quote, democracy has failed because so many fear sharing power. Their fear, he reasoned, is grounded in the belief that, quote, a world full of intelligent, healthy, and free people is impossible, unquote. Du Bois declared that this fear is false. He imagined a more hopeful future made possible by, quote, a vital, gigantic effort to realize real education for the broadest intelligence and for evoking talent and genius on a scale never attempted in the world, unquote. I believe California's teachers, with your support, can play an important role in bringing this bold and wondrous future into being. Thank you, and we welcome your questions at this time.
Wow, that's remarkable information from both of you. And I would like to invite questions from people on Zoom and also in the room. And I have a mic here, so I'm going to ask you to come up and get the mic if it's going to be your turn to ask a question. So, and if you're on Zoom, just raise your hand and I'll look for that, and you can unmute yourself and just ask a question. And Pia will. Let's start with Karen. Go ahead, Karen.
Thank you. So I just came from AACTE, and one of the things that AACTE is doing is partnering with Educators for American Democracy. I was on a panel with that committee, and they are looking at civics in K through 12, but how teacher educators can make that part of teacher education. And one of the things I realized is that's not in our TPEs. We do not have civics as part of our teaching performance expectations. So it's something that we need to engage in because of the climate that we're in. Our candidates need to know how to engage their PK through 12 students in civics and democracy in order to be successful in their PK. Well, our candidates need to know how to support their PK through 12 students. Our PK through 12 students need to know how to engage in civics. But AACTE is looking for additional individuals to engage in this work. So if you are a member, again, we're an affiliate of AACTE, CCTE is. So if this is something that interests you, they're looking for additional individuals to engage in this work. So be on the lookout for additional information in regards to that if you are a member of AACTE.
Thanks, Karen. Is there another comment or question in the room or on Zoom? I'm looking for hands raised on Zoom, or go ahead.
My name is Rick. I'm from USF. I saw something a few days ago. It needs to be confirmed, but I'm pretty sure it's true that the College Board, which I don't always agree with, but the College Board made a declaration that any district that enforces book banning, those AP courses will not be honored as advanced placement. So that would take out Toni Morrison and Baldwin and many other things. So that's the kind of pushback that we need to see.
I might
Thanks,
jump
Rick.
in.
Go ahead.
I might just jump here. I saw that as well. And it struck me as an example of, to John's point, there's the version of saying no, and then there's the sort of proactive declarations of the kind of education that's necessary for a multiracial democracy, and we're going to do. And the College Board's move, I guess, was a form of both, a sort of innovative, sort of pressing the lever they have to press, and saying, I read it as, if anybody enforces this legislation to shut down a topic and that's part of an AP course, you're not going to get our credit for that AP course. And one of the other forms of response that I'm finding very inspiring right now is youth organizing and community organizing. I've been attending a lot of events online and seeing young people, from Kentucky, parents from Missouri, places where there are legislative efforts, and places where they're not, where there are just book bans, but really engaging in civic action in a really exciting and impressive way. And I think it feels like we're kind of on the cusp of the nation turning to that. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about all of the youth energy that was uncorked in the summer and fall of 2020, and young people demanding to learn about their society, and a lot of educators reacting with excitement and professional development and curricular expansion. And so the sort of expected backlash against that, trying to censor, shut down, I think it's just just a moment of a matter of time, rather, before young people say, wait a minute, we called to learn about all this, and here we are shut down. So the other forms of standing up for the right to learn, I find pretty interesting right now.
Thanks, Micah. I think in reading through your report too, what I appreciate is the language that you give us to talk about these things together. The protecting the right to learn is just such a proactive way to talk about it, and to get involved. So looking at the room, there's a question in the back. I'm also watching for hands raised on Zoom if anybody wants to unmute themselves and add a question or a comment. We have about 6 minutes.
Okay. Thank you so much for your talk. I was curious if the teachers' unions had come out at all in support of teachers, especially given that they usually provide $1 million, right, worth of legal aid. So I'm curious about that, if the speakers could speak to that.
Micah, do you want to start off?
Sure. I mean, there were, I would say in the data, there were both examples of folks saying the union was a key player in protecting the right to learn, and folks asking for more support from unions, as well as other community members, as well as broader associations. There was a real desire in the data from educators in places where there were legislative efforts and places where there were not, but local campaigning, calling for clear guidance on what their freedoms were to keep teaching. We heard sort of crazy examples of, for example, our equity officers, people calling them saying, sort of fearing that even if they talked about being Black, it was somehow, quote, critical race theory and somehow, quote, off limits, right? And so a lot of people saying, what can I do? The equity officer said, what am I allowed to do? And so that backup, that I know the NEA has been trying to support in the realm of the district statement, which is another form of action right now, sort of template language for proactive district statements saying, we in this district support the right to learn on these issues in order to prepare students for a multiracial democracy that they will soon be running. And so I think the unions are both being asked to step up and are. John?
I think that's right. I think that the national unions over recent months have made their positions clear. Their support for teaching about issues of race, their support for issues of diversity and inclusion. They also have been put in a very difficult position because the conflict campaign was quite successful in framing the issue in a particular sort of way that was largely divorced from reality. And so it made it difficult for unions and other advocates to step forward and to make their positions known in a way that wasn't just amplifying the conflict that the conflict campaign aimed to create.
Right. And I would say on that point that the union folks that I've been talking to are very much behind the proactive, matter-of-fact, everyday language statement of what we do in this district, what kind of learning we're going for, sort of beyond buzzwords to, as one person said just to me earlier this week, a union person, when we describe what it is we're trying to do in teaching about race or doing DEI work in very matter-of-fact ways, and put our proactive vision like John did forward in front, parents sort of say, oh, I do want that. And so it's describing it matter-of-factly. And I think John is absolutely correct in sort of trotting out a caricature. What happened for months was everybody had to defend themselves against the caricature. We don't teach CRT or whatever, and sort of boxing themselves into a corner. And so the proactive messaging of the kind of teaching and learning that is necessary and that we do support in this district, a lot of folks are heading in that direction.
Thanks, Micah. We have time for 2 more questions. So let me grab one from the chat and then I'll get to you. Here's a question from Kalpana That. What protections are in place for educators who resist these efforts to silence their talk about racism, equity, and civic responsibility in the classroom where the school district may have gone silent? So kind of related to some of the things you were talking about. It's a question about protections.
John, you want to go first or should I?
You go ahead.
Okay. Our team has a paper coming out now about different forms of backup that actually educators talked to us about long before the conflict campaign that we think, really still hold. I mean, that there's the union backup. There is the administrator backup, which some people have and some people don't. But one of the points we're making is that, teachers can't really keep this right to include or to teach on these issues without mobilizing some backup. They can't do it alone. And so the educators in our data talked about other forms of backup that were really important, the community participation. I mean, a lot of this, the sort of intimidation stance of some of the conflict campaign has made more, has some amplified, in some cases, vocal minority voices, has made some parents afraid to go to the school board and speak themselves. We haven't heard nearly enough from young people backing up their desire to learn on these issues. And so I think we would argue that all of these are forms of protection for teachers going forward, local backup efforts, and plus the muscle of unions, plus sort of there are folks at Howard University, to my understanding, for example, beginning clinics where educators can show up and say, what are my rights under the various laws? So it's really, I think, a web of backup, including from those of us in the research field and who work in universities. And by the way, a lot of the new wave of legislation, we don't have time for this today, but is coming for higher education itself. And so all of us are really at a moment where we need to back up the freedom to learn for one another.
Two quick points, just to piggyback on what Micah said. One is that teacher education institutions have a role to play. We have leverage. We are institutions that schools and districts need. And if schools and districts are acting in ways that are violating fundamental norms and undermining democracy, we need to step up and use that leverage. The other point is that we need to support new teachers to forge the sorts of relationships with community groups, with youth groups, as Micah was suggesting, such that when these problems arise, they are parts of powerful coalitions. They're not left alone in an island.
Thank you so much. John and Micah, if you have 2 more minutes, I don't know what your hard stop is, but I know we have 2 more questions, one in the room, and then I'll let Dr. Flowers have the last question through Zoom. So do you want to go ahead over here?
I will. Thank you. My concern is that with the teacher shortage as it is, and COVID on top of that, and all the stressors that teachers are facing in the field, we are just losing teachers. Many, mid-career teachers saying, this is just too much. I can't handle this, especially when you add that hostile parent element. And so, just like we had, the testing board say that if you're going to erase critical race theory and, some of these authors from your program, we're not going to give you that advanced credit. What can we do in higher ed, especially with the laws coming down targeting us now, to kind of ensure that we are free to teach equity and diversity in our courses? And it's kind of like, if we have districts out there that are banning books, what would you recommend we do as a position? Should we be not placing our candidates in those districts, or what would you suggest us to do? It's a very sticky wicket.
John, you want to start?
I think you're right. It's a sticky wicket. It amplifies the dilemma of democratic education I was posing before. I think we need to lean into that dilemma, build political power, but build it in a way where we're listening to a variety of different constituencies, hearing their concerns, but also maintaining a deep commitment to these democratic principles and principles of racial justice and inclusion.
One of the equity officers described that as listening to all parties, but staying the course, with the big goal in mind of educating young people for the multiracial democracy they will soon lead. I think to the question, a lot of people have been pointing out, some of the same organizations heavily involved in the conflict campaign that we studied have been involved in pointing a cannon at public education itself for a very long time. And so, this is a new version of attacking public schooling itself. And so we could see this moment as an important, crucial, all hands on deck moment for public education itself, and turn the feel of this to, the kind of messaging that John was suggesting of, this is a moment to make the case, and I know the unions feel this way, for the importance of really, really great public K-12 education for a multiracial democracy. And it's now's our moment to make that case. And it's, I'm sort of seeing in the research field, among the folks we work with in our universities across the country, a kind of dawning. I think, the scale of this, all the legislation, the sudden targeting of higher ed, the targeting of tenure, the cascading of bills, I think people are just kind of waking up to the situation in some ways. And so we could see this as an important moment, and almost an exciting moment for our field to re-energize the call for the public schools we need. I'm not sure if that's a satisfying answer, but that's kind of where I'm at.
That's an encouraging answer. I'm going to let Doris Flowers from SF State have the last comment, and we're over time, so we'll wrap up as soon as we can. Doris.
I'm sorry. Yeah, it'll be quick. Hi, everybody. Thank you for this study too. It's very needed and necessary, and I'm glad to see it was done and what you've uncovered. But let me just say first that students really are demanding us to teach. Not necessarily critical race theory, but truth, and however that looks for us, that's what they're demanding us to do. So, and I think we have to, and I do think that we need change in our schooling. So, but my question is, I teach in our equity and social, I used to teach in our equity and social justice program. Actually, I started it, and isn't critical race theory more about the law though? And hasn't media really just misinterpreted, misperceived, or what critical race theory is? Or redefined it even, and has included other people in the mix of it, that they're banning their books. I mean, when did Maya Angelou's books and Toni Morrison's books become so critical race theory and not novels about their experience, their lived experience? So I don't know what that means. I'm not sure what the real question I have in there, but maybe that's just something I wanted to say. But the question I do have is, what does this do to AB 1420, I believe, the ethnic studies policy that just passed for schools?
So to the first part of your question, which I think raises an incredibly important point, that this, as Micah was suggesting, has never been about critical race theory as such. The people behind the campaign were very astute in putting together 3 words that are as scary as possible to many sectors of the American public: critical race and theory, and combining them in a way that came to mean nothing and everything at the same time. And so many different issues then just get thrown into the mix. To your second point about ethnic studies, I think that across different communities in California, the willingness of communities to support ethnic studies in a meaningful and robust way will be shaped by the extent to which we can build meaningful conversations and dialogue with diverse community members, and at the same time foster the sort of democracy enhancing public coalition building to support ethnic studies across different communities in the years ahead. I don't want to see a California in which we have amazing ethnic studies programs in Oakland and East LA, but not in the Central Valley. We want it across the state so that all Californians can come to see themselves and be part of this rich multiracial democracy.
I might just
Thank
add
you
that.
so
Oh,
much.
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Go
We're
ahead,
over time.
Micah. Go ahead. No, that's okay. Wrap us up.
Last word. I was just going to say that a punchline that remains in my head from this work with John and our team is the importance of local leaders, and how, in a state with a bill or a state without a bill, what happens in terms of the teaching, the daily work on race, diversity, inclusion, really is a local question of how people do ethnic studies, how they stand up for ethnic studies, how they insist on curricula for ethnic studies. That it's a mix of larger forces like state decisions and local action. And so I think in this conflict campaign context, that's still the punchline, in some ways even more so, is the need, where I live in San Diego, to keep going toward ethnic studies done well, and so and I think your prior point about the caricaturing of critical race theory was definitely a major theme throughout our report. And and like I said earlier, has put people sort of boxed many of us in the position. I would say the classic response has been, we don't do critical race theory in K-12 because it's a legal framework. At the same time, the core of critical race theory is really just a very clear-eyed exploration of how racism has shaped our society. And that is something that kids should learn in K-12 because they're about to run that society and they need to learn its realities. And so, you know, I personally think that sticking with the everyday matter-of-fact language for what kids should be learning rather than getting boxed in the corner with other people's frames is the way to go. But what I said about critical race theory itself is how I really see it. A necessary exploration of systemic racism that, of course, we should learn.
Thank you both so much.
Thank
Another
you.
round of applause for our speakers.
Thank
And
you.
please convey to your team of grad students how much we appreciate their work. And I encourage everyone to download the full report, read it, share it broadly. Share it with your university administrators, share it with your teammates back in your colleges. It's really remarkable work, and I think it's helping us take some important strides. So we have a shorter break than we thought, but that's okay. I think you can, for those of you, sorry for those on Zoom, there's no cookies for you unless they're in your own kitchen, but we have cookies and some fruit, more coffee. In-person participants, one of the roundtable sessions will be right here. And the other one will be in the quorum room, which is second floor. Thank you. Haven't been here for a while. Monica knows. And then Zoom participants, we have a very special set of roundtables for you. So I will hand you over to Nicole Howard to help you navigate that. It's a pretty exciting group of 5 presentations for you if you're a Zoom participant. So we will rejoin as a whole at 2 o'clock. Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Micah and John. That was wonderful.